I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after another series of deadly strikes on civilians in Sumy, Russia continues to push ahead in the north of the region. Meanwhile, we assess the damages from Operation Spider's Web and the Kerch Bridge explosion. We also dive into the UK's strategic defence review and what it means for Ukraine, while the UK promises 100,000 drones to Ukraine by spring 2026.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 4th of June. 3 years and 101 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, and chemical weapons expert and former tank commander Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. First, let's turn to the news from the battlefield. Roland, what do you have for us?
Let's start again up in Sumy. If you imagine the ground combat theatre as a clock, that's pretty much at 12 o'clock on the border with Russia's Kerch region. Russia has continued to advance here in that kind of buffer zone that it's trying to create about 30 kilometres north of Sumy city itself. They say today they've captured the village of Kindrat. They also took Oleksievka, which we mentioned yesterday. Now, Kindratovska is actually on the western flank of the buffer zone they'd already established, so it looks like they're pushing to expand the size of that foothold. Again, it's not that deep. It's only a kind of 8-10 kilometres deep at its nearest point. It's more like mostly kind of 3 kilometres deep, this patch. But Vladimir Putin has talked about creating a buffer zone along the border in that area. Just a reminder, Volodymyr Zelensky warned last month that Moscow was massing about 50,000 troops for a fresh offensive around Sumy. The city is about 25 kilometres south from the current battle line. A Russian rocket strike on Sumy on Tuesday killed 4 people, which we reported then. Moving quite quickly through the Kharkiv region, where there's not much to report. Down to the front near Liman. So if you're looking at the map, you're looking kind of straight east from the... If you look at the city of Izum and you kind of drive straight east, you get to this area of front line that runs roughly north to south. And I mentioned yesterday that the Russians have pushed a kind of 6-kilometre long finger between 2 villages there in an apparent attempt to gain some momentum in that area over the past week. Well, this morning, they claim that they have now captured one of those 2 villages. It's a village of Rydkodub. So clearly a part of the front to keep an eye on. Moving further south of Kramatorsk, Russian forces have advanced towards the village of Dilivka. There are Russian advances reported in the area between Ozaryanivka and Druzhba, northeast of Toretsk. In Pokrovsk, which is the kind of most intense battle at the moment, lots of confused reporting. I think rather than me getting into the nitty-gritty of, which patch of field the Russians have pushed another 100 yards over or the Ukrainians have pushed them back on, have a look at our website. We have an extraordinary report on there, a wonderful dispatch from a journalist who spent 24 hours inside Pokrovsk itself with the Ukrainian army, which is not something, it's difficult to get in there these days. So if you want a good, serious colour account of what it actually looks like on the ground in Pokrovsk, have a look at that. Further west, we do have reports of small Ukrainian counterattacks further east in getting into the kind of the Zaporizhia region, the areas around Huliopolye and Orikhiv, and that's about it for movement on the front line. Air war overnight. Russia didn't fire any missiles, but it launched 112 drones. 60 were shot down, 15 stopped by electronic warfare, according to the Ukrainian Air Force. That means a third, roughly, got through air defences. A bit more on the strikes on Sumy yesterday, which we mentioned, actually, in yesterday's pod, but they landed about 9 a.m. The final toll, the current toll is 4 people killed, 20 others, including 3 children, injured. We now believe there were 5 attacks, 5 different volleys of multiple launch rocket systems on yesterday morning in that area. Okay, other military developments. You'll remember as we came on air yesterday, the SBU, Ukraine's security service, announced that it had set off a bomb underneath the Kerch Bridge, the bridge that links mainland Russia with Crimea. They said they had taken months kind of hiding large amounts of explosive in the supporting pillars below the waterline and put out a video showing a big splash, big explosion underwater. Russia has now confirmed that happened. So Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, says there was indeed an explosion, but nothing was damaged. The bridge is working. One would suspect that if you've put that much effort into an operation, you might have been hoping to maybe actually disable the bridge, which would have been, quite a massive win for the Ukrainians, but looks at the moment like it's still open and still operating. A few more details from Operation Spider's Web, or Cobweb. We still haven't got an answer to that question, but I think it's only the English that makes a distinction between spiders' webs and cobwebs. Anyway, this was the Ukraine's audacious drone strike on Russian long-range bombers over the weekend. The damage assessments coming out of that are still coming in. The latest from Bloomberg. This is from Bloomberg. Bloomberg reports 7 Tu-95 Bear bombers and 4 Tu-22s. The NYT reports at least 96 Tu-95s. Our colleagues Joe Barnes and James Rushton reported yesterday that Operation Spiders or Cobweb had also successfully damaged at least 2 of Russia's A-50 surveillance planes. You'll have heard Dom on here explaining previously about how these are basically the equivalent of Western AWACS planes. They're the things that kind of fly around in the air like large radar domes, gathering intelligence, coordinating communication, things like that. Very important. Ukraine's Air Force spokesman says, this is the last thing on this, I know it's confusing, the last source on this is 41 aircraft were hit, probably only 13 destroyed. So that's the latest damage assessment from Operation Cobweb. One other thing to note, I'm going to note this because I think The Economist wrote about it yesterday. The Ukrainian General Staff, and I know you have to, take with a slight pinch of salt what one side says about the other side's casualties. The Ukrainian General Staff claims that Russia has now lost 991,820 troops since the February 24 invasion. That's all casualties, so killed, wounded, and so on. And as noted in the Economist article earlier this week, that would mean that Russia is approaching its millionth casualty in the war, which is a simply extraordinary figure for any conflict fought by any major power since 1945. Of course, if you go back before 1945, perhaps it's not quite as hair-raising a figure, which leaves me kind of reflecting, and forgive me for philosophizing a little bit, Adélie, it's another sign we are no longer in the post-1945 world. Our historical context that we live in now goes much further back. I think that's pretty much where we are. One last thing from the British MOD. Britain yesterday announced, or at least overnight I got it into my inbox, that it is going to provide Ukraine with an additional 100,000 drones by April 2026. It's a tenfold increase in drone production and procurement to support Ukraine. It's part of a £350 million spend this year. This is from the British Ministry of Defence, and they also say the UK is to provide a further $247 million for training the armed forces of Ukraine this year. Adélie, that's pretty much the military updates.
Thank you, Roland. And I will follow through with the politics and diplomatic updates. Dom and Francis will be back in the chair tomorrow. But meanwhile, the first news item on the list is that a Ukrainian delegation has arrived in Washington. It's led by Deputy Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko and Zelensky's right-hand man, Andriy Yermak. They posted this on Telegram, and they'll be discussing Senator Lindsey Graham's proposed sanctions bill, the return of children deported by Russia, and what came out of the Istanbul talks. So, not much. On Tuesday, the White House said that Trump would not rule out participating in a trilateral meeting with Putin and Zelensky, but yesterday, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, said that such a meeting was, I quote, unlikely to happen soon. Furthermore, on Telegram yesterday, the Russian Security Council Deputy Chairperson Dmitry Medvedev claimed that Russia needs the negotiations in Istanbul to result in Russia's, I quote, swift victory in the complete destruction of the Ukrainian government and, quotes again, not a compromised peace on someone else's delusional terms. So just like yesterday in the comments about children and the soft-hearted European aunties, I quote from memory there, some very stark and undiplomatic language coming from Russia. Medvedev stated that Russia's Istanbul memorandum was in line with these goals and threatened that Russia will, I quote, explode everything and, I quote again, disappear anyone who opposes Russia in response to Operation Spider's Web, or again, Cobweb, to be discussed. The Institute for the Study of War says that the statement shows once more Moscow's disinterest in good faith peace negotiations and a near-term resolution of the war. Meanwhile, some polls coming from Russia, that's in the Kyiv Independent, there's a record number of Russians who support the peace talks and the end of the war in Ukraine. It shows that 64% of the respondents favoured the peace talks, which is a 6% increase since March. Looking towards Ukraine's economy now, that's from the Wall Street Journal. Ukraine declined to pay holders of $2.6 billion in warrants linked to the country's GDP, defaulting on its sovereign debt payment. Ukraine's finance minister said last week that the country plans to complete a comprehensive restructuring of its sovereign obligations, and that not paying the holders at this time was a planned move. He said that it was part of the nation's broader strategy to ensure long-term debt sustainability without threatening Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. That's a quote. The debt securities were already left out of a larger restructuring of the country's sovereign bonds last year. Now, turning to another story in The Telegraph today from our colleague US reporter Benedict Smith, he uncovered that the senior official who dismantled the US government's Russian disinformation unit is in fact married to a Russian woman who has ties to the Kremlin. The senior official, Darren Beattie, was appointed acting undersecretary for public diplomacy and public affairs last February. And already his very pro-Russia views had raised alarm within the State Department. Now, Benedict Smith's investigation uncovers that he is married to a woman whose uncle has taken several roles in Russian politics over the last 20 years and has once received a personal thank you message from Vladimir Putin. In the years before joining the government, Mr. Beattie wrote social media posts suggesting Western institutions should be, I quote, infiltrated by Putin, while he also attacked what he described as the, I quote again, globalist American empire. His wife, Ms. Kirilova, is the niece of Sergei Chernikov, a Russian drinks magnate. His net worth, it was estimated at $150 million in 2005. He reportedly received a letter of thanks from Putin for his help in the election campaign which first brought the Russian leader to power. And last item from me, Latvia was elected yesterday to the United Nations Security Council for the first time in its history. He was elected alongside 4 other countries, but Latvia is the only one for which it's the first time. The other countries are Bahrain, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Liberia. They will all serve a 2-year term beginning January 2026 as non-permanent members of the UN Security Council. And Latvian Foreign Minister Baiba Brace called it a historic day for Latvia. We'll have to see what the face-off with Russia will bring, which is obviously a permanent member of the UN Security Council with veto power. And now turning to our correspondent in Brussels. So you are covering the Ukraine Defense Group today. Can you tell me a bit more about where you are and what's on the agenda?
Yeah, so up at NATO today, we have defence ministers from 50 or so countries meeting as part of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, otherwise known as the Ramstein format. It's previously been completely run by the Americans, Lloyd Austin, the former Defence Secretary of America, but now it is run and co-chaired by the UK and Germany. I think the first interesting thing to say is this meeting is being tied to a meeting of NATO defence ministers that happens tomorrow. So Pete Hegseth is going to be in town and around, but he has chosen not to turn up to this meeting today. He has previously dialed in virtually and attended the first one under the new British-German format. So quite interesting. It happens in about an hour's time. We'll hear from John Healey. He's going to give some words at the top of the meeting before giving a press conference later this afternoon. But I'll run you through some of the things that have been announced, mainly from the British, because we're expecting a number of military packages to be announced, as is the tradition in this format. So it's all about providing military support and coordinating military support for Ukraine. And the Brits have said that they are going to increase drone pledges to Ukraine. That that means by April 2026, the UK is going to have supplied Ukraine with 100,000 drones. Package is worth around £350 million, and it's not new money. It's part of that £4.5 billion that the Labour government have said they will give to Ukraine this year. And it comes at a really interesting time. Drones, according to Western intelligence services, like the experts, are responsible for about between 60 and 80% of all Russian casualties and damaged vehicles and destroyed vehicles. You've only had to see what the drones did during Operation Spider's Web on those airfields. So it's really important. And Britain's basically saying that we're going to help you by producing some, but also investing money into your defence industry to produce these drones, 100,000 by April 2026. John Healey had this to say: the UK is stepping up its support for Ukraine by delivering hundreds of thousands more drones this year and completing a major milestone in the delivery of critical artillery. And he said, we are learning lessons every day from the battlefield in Ukraine, which British companies are using to advance new drones to help protect Ukraine's civilians and also strengthen our own national security. I believe we're going to have a chat through the strategic defence review shortly. I may have to shoot off beforehand, but one of the key elements that Keir Starmer mentioned is we are learning the lessons from the battlefields of Ukraine, and that is what Healey is referring to there. And I'll stop there on the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, and I will hopefully be back tomorrow to actually tell you what happened.
That would be great. Thank you, Joe. I'll let you shoot off because I know you have a lot on your plate. Thank you very much for joining us quickly today, and we look forward to having you back tomorrow. Thank you. And now turning to Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. So we've already discussed on Monday the strategic defence review, and that was before the document came out fully. So we're just debating what could be in there. So we're going to dig into that a bit more with you today. And that's because it matters beyond the UK. I know we have a lot of listeners who are not from the UK, and one could think it's a domestic issue, but it obviously is not, considering the global context. It's a major Western military power trying to recalibrate its defence in response to the emerging dangers that we're now facing. And whatever is decided based on the SDR will have ramifications for Ukraine and will tell us a lot about how warfare is evolving, both for the UK but also for the rest of Europe. So, Hamish, do you want to talk us through maybe the main takeaways from the SDR and what your reaction is?
Yeah, certainly, Adélie. Yeah, I'm not going to pick through it and find out detail. I just want to pick out some things which I think are really significant and are important. The main thing to realise up front is this is shaping UK military capability really over the next decade or so. So a lot of what's in it is not happening now, is going to happen in 5 to 10 years. The delivery of 12 nuclear attack submarines, absolutely the right thing to do, in my opinion. Cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, sort of stuff that works very well in Ukraine. That is not coming on board for some time. But the aspiration is correct. So I think people need to be aware of that. The other thing, I'm not going to go into the money. I'm not a financial whiz kid, but everything that appears to be in the Strategic Defence Review seems to add up a little bit more than the promised 3% by 2034. And that's something that really I think that the government needs to look into. But some of the specifics, which I think are really important. And yeah, having gone through the document, it looks like really well researched. They've taken a lot of evidence. Absolutely has been focused on the Ukraine war, because that is previously our military has been a capability for the status quo ante, the previous war. We've been so shaped by our counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan that actually, if we had to fight in Ukraine today, we might be challenged. I think we're learning very quickly. And as I wrote in my piece the other day, at the beginning of the war, we were training the Ukrainians. Now it's sort of the other way around, and we're learning. But just look at a couple of areas. The cyber and the electronic magnetic spectrum stuff is bang on. He who controls the electronic magnetic spectrum, I'll call it EMS, really controls the battlefield, and we've learned that. The one thing I would say is obviously jamming has been absolutely key to all this. When you jam all your electronics, you are left with the basics: the soldier with the rifle, the tank. You can fire as much electronics as you like at the tank as possible, and it will still rumble on. And I think we must remember our reversionary modes, as we call them in the military. And when we talk about soldiers, mass numbers, is important. I think it was either IISS or Rusi did a study or professed an argument, and I think the previous Chief of the General Staff, Patrick Saunders, somebody I served most of my career with, said the British Army at its current numbers would probably last 4 to 6 weeks in a conflict like Ukraine. Now, that is a pretty harrowing statement, and it's something that is not really addressed in the SDR. There's a lot of talk about reserves. I'm a reservist. I think we're a much underutilised piece. There are about 100,000 of us. We're all ex-military, all pretty well trained. Some of us are pretty long in the tooth, but we still know how to do bits and pieces. So the numbers, no increase in the army. I think that is something that the MOD are probably going to have to look at. But I want to focus just on two areas. And we've heard so much about spiders, cobweb, whatever we're calling it, and what an impact that's had. And actually, the way that the SBU, the Ukraine Security Service, have worked, they have had some real strategic impact, real strategic effect, which is what special forces, security services, that is really what they're there to do. And it strikes me the SBU are now, they're sort of operating on a framework like the SOE, the Special Operations Executive in the Second World War, which is sort of a combination of military special forces, security services, and others, anybody else who's got a particular skill and has the wherewithal. And how effective it was in the Second World War, how effective it's been for Ukraine. I'm slightly surprised there's not a little bit more. That there is talk about special forces in the SDR, but it just strikes me that that they're a very small asset, and there is a certain size they can get to, because there are few who can operate in that sort of environment. But I'm surprised there isn't a bit more on that. I'm surprised there is a little bit more about integration to produce a capability like the SBU have been able to do, but maybe we'll come back to that. The other element to it, which I think really stood out to me, is the nuclear piece. Now, we've discussed this before, and I obviously don't want to go over old ground, but the nuclear deterrent works on parity and equilibrium. That's why it has kept the peace since the end of the Second World War. With what's happened, particularly with the Americans and Trump in the last sort of few months, and what's happening in Ukraine, I think has put that nuclear equilibrium out. And really what I'm talking about there is on the tactical nuclear weapons side. Now, we have heard that quite a lot of those Bear bombers that carry the Russian tactical nuclear weapons are out of service. But, we must not discount that, especially the frequency with which Putin and Medvedev and Peskov and others threaten us with nuclear attack. I think it was interesting in SDSR, there is a bit there that Britain must prepare more for potential nuclear attack. I know there are a few headlines in some of the red tops, as it were, today about this, and perhaps people are getting a little bit vexed by it. But again, during the Cold War, we were pretty well prepared for it. There are probably not too many listeners my age who remember it, but during the Cold War, we had the adverts on the BBC News telling us what to do in the case of it. And it's very good reminding people about that. And the fact there's been an SDSR that the government and the National Health Service and all others need to stock up on gas masks and radiation detectors and that sort of thing. Well, that's sort of what we had in the Cold War. And the other thing with the nuclear deterrent, if somebody is resilient, it's like any threat. If you look at your enemy and you think they're resilient to a certain threat, then you sort of don't go there. And we must show to the Russians that we are resilient. And the sort of final piece on the nuclear side, tactical nuclear piece, 1997 is when Britain gave up its tactical nuclear weapons. The same year that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons at the Budapest Treaty, because the Americans, the Russians and ourselves guaranteed their security. And just my first point about, SDSR doesn't really come into play until, 5 to 10 years. Actually, I personally believe, and there was rumours that the MOD are talking about, but it's gone very quiet, about buying F-35 Alphas, which are the nuclear capable version of the stealth fighter. And to me, that would be a way to redress this equilibrium in the tactical nuclear space. And I think, that would probably be more would have more an impact on Putin and the Kremlin than a whole host of other things. So those are the sort of standout bits and pieces. But overall, I think it's a really good piece of work. It's quite a long read. It's worth reading for people who have a deep interest in this, because it does go into the detail of how they've come to the conclusions on various things. And the Ukraine war is absolutely shaping it. Over.
Thanks, Hamish. That was very comprehensive. I'd like to bring in Roland to continue with this conversation as well, because Roland, you just interviewed Lord Robertson this morning, who's one of the authors of the SDR. It's going to be an interview that's coming out on Friday on the podcast you co-host with our colleague Venetia Rainey, Battle Lines, the sister podcast. Can you bring us into the interview a little bit and give us your insights?
Yeah, it was great. So, yes, Lord Robertson very kindly came in. We've actually been chasing him for a while, and he's been kind of cloistered, unable to speak to the press until the SDR came out. So I grabbed him, said, come into the studio. He very kindly did. Yeah, so for the full interview, tune in on Friday. It was pretty interesting. I'm quite interested to see. Hamish sounds pretty positive about this whole review. I mean, you'll know that anyone who's been following this will have noticed that a lot of the criticism that it's faced, or the government's faced, is around money, about whether or not it's really feasible, whether the government is really going to find the money they've said they accept all these findings, but will they actually find the money to deliver on them? And this question of whether or not, whether the government is actually going to find this 3% of GDP that it says is only an ambition to achieve in the next parliament, or whether it should be saying, no, it's going to happen, it's not just an ambition, or whether, in fact, it should be at 3.5%. We had NATO sources, I think, talking to Joe, who is just on the front page of today's paper. And not just our paper, there is a NATO summit later this month in The Hague, and what we're hearing is that NATO wants everybody to spend 3.5%, not 3%. So a lot of pressure around the money. Lord Robertson's point, which you'll hear if you listen to the interview, and which he kind of made that point as we were walking up the stairs as well, was, look, it's not, I get why people are asking that question, but this isn't really about the money. It's about something much more fundamental. It's about looking at revising Britain's entire defence posture in view of how dramatically the world has changed over the past few years. And as Hamish said, there is a lot of talk in there about reserves and stuff, but I think the message he really wanted to get across was about this. He kept on talking about a conversation that has to happen with society. And I think the thrust of that is that in a state-on-state, peer-on-peer war of the scale of what is happening in Ukraine, or on the scale of what, God forbid, a conventional war between NATO and one of its adversaries would look like, that is not something that the armed forces can fight by themselves. It would not be like the Falklands War or the Gulf Wars or Iraq and Afghanistan, which were all affairs that were pretty much left to, the Ministry of Defence and the military. It would require a large-scale mobilisation of the whole of society, industry, obviously, the health service, obviously, but also everybody else. And I think part of a big message of what he wanted to get across was this idea that, politicians need to start talking to the public about this. And another interesting point I kept on pushing on this money question. Should the government be spending more, and so on? And his answer was kind of similar to, let's see, it chimed with what he was saying about a national conversation. He said, look, we just had a general election in which defence was barely mentioned. We've just had a Conservative leadership race in which defence was barely mentioned. So if you believe we're entering this much more dangerous world where more resources would have to move to defence, and therefore, basically, what that means is people paying more taxes, or the government borrowing more money with all the knock-on effects that could have, or cutting other services that people are going to feel, that is a conversation that government has to have with the nation. And I think he and his co-authors seem concerned that conversation isn't happening enough at the moment. And he seemed determined to get that conversation going, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That sounds fascinating. I really look forward to hearing the interview, which we'll probably clip on the podcast on Friday. Hamish, did you have any comments on what we just heard?
Yeah, I've actually written a piece for the British Forces News website on this, and I do the money thing. That is the thing that really doesn't add up. But yeah, Roland's piece on and what Laura Robertson's saying, this is a sort of national effort and everything else. And I'm pretty upbeat. Maybe I've got a son who's going through military training at the moment. I'm still very closely involved with all this sort of stuff. And I hear so much in the press and everything that the youth of the day, they're too woke, they're too soft, they're not interested in fighting the country, etc., and all that sort of stuff. And we could never, the fact that we're supposed to have 72,000 soldiers at the moment, but we can only recruit up to 70,000 is systematic of the place we're in, which I think is just absolutely wrong. The young boys and girls I know who are joining the army, either going to Sandhurst or going to soldier training, are absolutely first class. I spoke to a young lad on the train the other day. He was coming down from Harrogate. He was doing his basic training. He was 16. He was absolutely engaged. He thought it was brilliant. He told me he was earning, I think it was 25 grand as a 16-year-old doing his basic military training and being educated, doing his GCSEs and A-levels. And I just thought it was fantastic. But it's illustrated to me that we're not, the MOD and the government are not selling themselves very well. And when it comes to recruitment, the recruitment system is so clunky. And I did a bit of work for one of the other broadsheets last year, and 75% of young boys and girls who try and join the army give up because it takes too long. But to get into officer training takes about 2 years, which when you're 22 is a lifetime. I think there is a messaging thing that I get from Laura Robertson and get out there. But ultimately, I've said it on many podcasts in the last sort of couple of weeks, I think when people say this, our forebears in 1939 probably thought the same as they did in 1913. But by God, the whole country mobilised and got behind it eventually. But I think there is, to use a military term, preparation of the battlefield. I think the government needs to do that. We need to have the conversation. And absolutely, again, I find myself agreeing with Lord Robertson a bit too much, which is kind of strange. That, however much SDR costs, whether it's 3%, 3.5%, 4% or 5%, if the country believes that is required, then absolutely we will pay through tax or whatever else. And I do find it strange. I think people who listen to this podcast and people who stay engaged with it understand what the threats are and how serious things are at the moment. But there are an awful lot of other people who, for very good reasons, are struggling or just doing other things who don't realise. And if you are struggling because of the cost of living, the fact that there's a hell of a war going on 1,000 miles away might not be your primary concern. Yeah, I think, I am quite upbeat about SDR. It's very easy to criticise, but I think, what they've come up with, whether they can get the money and having that national conversation, I think is really important.
Going back to your point about recruitment and joining the armed forces, you've told me that you thought reinvestment in the reserve was essential. What do you think we can learn from other countries, and especially Nordic countries who have more of a tradition of military service?
Yeah, I think we can learn a heck of a lot. I think the way that the Finns and the Swedes do it, and the Norwegians, I mean, it's seen as a really good thing. I mean, crikey, if you're a top university student and you opt to do reserve service in the military, I think, some of the detail might be a bit wrong here, but you get your tuition fees paid, but you've got to be in the top 30%, and it's something people really strive for. I mean, if both my children had their university tuition fees paid off, then one of them is in the army, admittedly, but I'm sure the other one would be as well. So things like the incentives, you've got to incentivize the people you're trying to attract, and different things do different appeal in different ways. And I know in SDR it talks about, instead of going on a gap year and finding yourself in riding a horse in Australia, actually spending a year in the army and learning a whole bunch of skills and going places might be a good thing. And for some, yeah, it might well be. But so I think we got a lot to learn from the Scandinavians and Finland. They can put 1 million people in the military in X number of weeks, which is phenomenal. And even places like Switzerland, where everybody's trained in basic military stuff. So we just need to get aboard. And the reservists, there are another 100,000 people like me. And you look at all the veterans chat and everything else, most of them would quite willingly get involved, actually do things. As a reservist, you have a commitment for, I don't know exactly what it is, 20 years after you leave the military, that you can be recalled at any time. And during operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, some reservists were recalled. There are people like me who do stuff anyway. But actually, those 100,000, what a resource. Can't imagine any other industry, in inverted commas, would let such a valuable resource rot on the vine, if it were. But I say it's got to be funded. Part of the SDR is securing key national infrastructure. Down here in Dorset, there must be thousands of ex-military who have a reserve liability. And I bet if you paid them one day a month to go and guard Windthrift Nuclear Power Station, you'd be overwhelmed with people wanting to do it. It's a great resource, and it's a community who really want to get involved. So I would have thought that would be an area that needs to be focused on. But overall, yeah, how the and I know Brits and Scandinavians are slightly different people, but yeah, at the end of the day, I think we can learn a heck of a lot from them.
Roland, I have one last question for you. So on Monday, when the SDR came out, it was also the day when we were starting to report about Operation Spider's Web. And a lot of the conversation has been about how innovative this operation was and how, innovative Ukraine is in warfare, changing the face of warfare. Did you have any conversation with Lord Robertson about how that operation resonates with where the SDR is taking UK defence policy, and any thoughts on that?
Oh, sure. I mean, he brought that up himself. I think partly because I was badgering him about the size of the army and shouldn't it be bigger? And part of his response was, look, war is changing, ingenuity it changes things. Just look at what the Ukrainians pulled off this weekend. There is a huge emphasis on, if you read the document, there's a huge emphasis on adapting to modern technology and the opportunities that it provides, which I think you have to be a bit careful there, because people for years and years in defence review after defence review, these come, every new government brings one of these out. And they've often talked about drones or future warfare, and often it's cover for being able to cut manpower because manpower is expensive, actually. But I think there's a genuine point there that the ingenuity and the resourcefulness that the war has given rise to. And to be fair, and the Ukrainians have certainly startled the world with Operation Spider's Web and so on, but it's not just them who are learning in this war. Like the Russians themselves, they came up with these fiber optic cable-driven drones and so on. Necessity is the mother or the father, the parent of invention. Yeah, put a big emphasis on that and talking about that and so on. And I think the other thing that he raised was about intelligence when we were talking about the lessons from the Ukraine war. One of the lessons is about the importance of intelligence. And one of the lessons comes not from the Ukrainian side, but from the Russian side. They had a terrible intelligence blunder at the beginning of this war. They were too, it wasn't reliable, and they ended up doing something very foolish based on faulty stuff. So there is also in the SDR a big emphasis on, I think it's something about bringing the three services intelligence branches together and then integrating them with the wider intelligence community. I skimmed this paragraph, to be honest. But yeah, a big emphasis on that kind of thing, the ingenuity, the sneaky stuff, the high-end stuff. My final thought on that would be that I think the Brits have always put certainly recently, a big emphasis on their special forces capability. I think it's something that, Hamish will maybe know more about this than me, but my impression is that successive governments have made a big virtue of things like the SAS and the Special Support Group and, I suppose, 16 Air Assault Brigade and things like that, partly because we don't have the mass to do many other things. So I feel like Britain's already, correct me if I'm wrong, I kind of feel like Britain's already in a reasonably good place in terms of special forces and things. The kind of thing I worry about is, if you listen to the interview, you'll hear me badgering poor Lord Robertson about the size of the army and about the number of casualties it would take in a conventional war.
Well, just tying into that, and that's my last question for the two of you, I guess, is would the UK have the military capability to do an operation like Operation Spider's Web?
Maybe I can come on to that. To me, the most impressive thing about Spider's Web, and it's slightly similar to the Israeli security force operation to blow up the push-to-talk radios and pages of Hezbollah last year, is the detail and time. From what we understand, this Operation Spider's Web was 18 months in the planning. So when you asked, would we have the capability to do that sort of thing? I think we would potentially on paper, and certainly, when it comes to special forces, SBU, SAS, SBS, and SRR, Special Reconnaissance Regiment, these are the very finest soldiers, men and women that you're ever going to find who could do that. But I think Roland makes a really good point, and maybe it comes out in your discussion with Lord Robertson. On the intelligence side, we have the defence intelligence, and then, of course, we have the other intelligence gathering. And, without breaking any confidentialities, we know about GCHQ, what it does, our own security service, MI6 and MI5. I would have thought that part of the focus, and maybe what Lord Robertson's saying, is actually the integration of all those together much closer. They are, in my experience, when you meet these super specialist type people and organisations, they're quite sort of insular, because that's how they operate, and that's where they find, operational security is so very important, and it's all about a need to know, and who's linked to who, and that creates sort of stovepipes, if you like. But I think what we're saying here, what Robertson's saying and others, is actually in the intelligence world, that is not a good thing. So, but culturally, that's how these organisations operate. So, I think that's something that maybe is an area we can go forward on. Maybe technology allows us to do this. You think in the old days of spies going around and dead letterboxes and all the rest of it to pass information, they're trying to create tempo and action was really difficult. Technologies allow us to change here, but also gives us extra vulnerabilities. So, very long answer to your question. Yes, I'm sure we could do it, but I expect what all these various security organisations are learning from SBU operations is you probably need to be, remove some of the stovepipes and work much more as an integration rather than separate entities. I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure it does.
Roland, do you have thoughts on this?
I just don't know enough about it. I mean, could Britain's special forces or secret services pull off something like that? I've no idea. I don't know. I mean, I presume so. But I mean, a lot of this is about, talking about lessons from the Ukraine war. I mean, I think, what clearly comes through, if you read the document and, if you listen on Friday, you'll hear is that, a huge amount of attention has been paid to what's worked, what hasn't worked, what is there, and also what isn't there in that war, and learning from everything that's happened or hasn't happened. And the other point, which has been made by quite a few people who've been involved in the process, who I've spoken to, is that, look, Ukraine it's a template and it's telling us a hell of a lot, but it's not the perfect template. One thing that's been put to me is that, look, kind of air power is not that present in the Ukraine context. It might have a much larger role or so on in a NATO versus peer kind of context, and so on and so forth. And the other thing is obviously the nuclear question. That plays a key role in Britain's and NATO's concepts of deterrence. Ukraine, as we know, doesn't have any nuclear weapons. There's that debate about whether it should have given them up in the first place. So, I mean, I'm sure everybody is studying that operation in great detail.
Thanks, Roland. Let's move on to our final thoughts then. And I will start with a bit of a cheeky one and a bit of a personal one as well. The vast majority of listeners who write in have been very supportive since I've started hosting the podcast, and really thank you. It's been very good to hear, and it's, made the transition into this new role easier. But a few people have left comments about my accent and how grating it was. And, that I don't really care, because obviously I know it's not for everyone, and I understand that I'm not a native English speaker. But one of them really made me smile a couple of days ago, because it said she's trying to speak with a posh British accent when English is not even her native language. And I thought, wow, so many years of trying to actually properly learn English and get as close as I could to a native English speaker. And that's not something that's going down well with some people. So just for a bit of a joke, I'm going to finish this episode not putting on a posh British accent and just speaking with my French accent. So that was my final thought. Roland, do you have a final thought for us?
This is fabulous. Do you know an old British sitcom called Hello, Hello?
No, I don't, I'm afraid.
I have to. Okay, I'm going to show you some of that after the film. What silly billies, Adélie. I mean, doing this second language, I think everyone's in awe of you. And also, what a place to arrive as well. You know, in the upper echelons of the English class system. You never know where you're going to land when you start speaking this language. So my final thought is, having done a little bit of research, I'm fairly sure that most languages don't make this English distinction between cobwebs and spiders' webs, as far as I can tell, following on from yesterday. So we'll leave that there. The very final thought is, of course, look, please tune in on Friday, and we'll be writing a piece of the paper. We had a really long discussion with Lord Robertson about the SDR, about the lessons from Ukraine, about security, all these questions that I think, the listeners to this podcast, I hope, will be, fascinated to talk about. We could have talked for much longer, quite honestly, because there is so much to get into, and he was very generous with his time. So yes, lots more military, SDR, NATO, Ukraine, big meaty conversation coming your way on Battle Lines on Friday.
Looking forward to it. And yes, French does not make the distinction between spiderweb and cobweb. We talked about that a couple of days ago. It is really hard keeping that French accent. Hamish, I'm afraid you have lost your H because French people don't say H's. What's your final thought?
Well, I think your accent's brilliant, French or English. And my final thought is slightly tongue-in-cheek as well. Many people might have read Danny Sheridan's piece in the paper today where she got the scoop on who's going to be the next chief of the General Staff, the current Chief of the Air Staff, and I gave a very tongue-in-cheek quote, which rather sent the comments section on the Telegraph going into absolute overdrive. I pointed out that the new CDS has no operational medals or campaign medals, which was rather strange after 30 years service. I did 25, and I won't say how many I've got, but a few, like a lot of my contemporaries. And it seemed to be a bit strange when the other candidate, General Raleigh Walker, is highly decorated for gallantry and many operational medals. And of course, it's well known he's ex-SAS as well. And at this time when we're so close to war, it seems strange to have somebody in command who's got no medals against somebody who's got thousands. But I would say that was very tongue-in-cheek, and I'm sure the Prime Minister knows best. That's my final thought. Over.
Last week, Dom quickly caught up with Michael Weiss, editor of The Insider. Here's their conversation.
So I'm chatting with Michael Weiss, editor of The Insider, investigative journalist and deep expert on Russia's clandestine services. Michael, we in the UK know a bit about Russian Unit 29155 of the GRU, responsible for the Skripal attempted poisoning with a Novichok nerve agent, but they have continued to be active and expanding. Is it fair to say that Russia is repurposing its special services?
Yeah, I think what we're beginning to see now with the GRU is a kind of return to first principles. They're doing the kinds of things that they got up to in the 1920s and 30s. Attempted insurrection in the case of Montenegro, that was 29155, assassinations, sabotage operations, trying to interdict Western supply chains of military equipment, security assistance to Ukraine. I mean, we've seen cases of this in the UK already, hiring amateur agents of influence, or in many cases just kind of low-level riffraff, people with criminal backgrounds who just are looking for easy money, connecting with them on Telegram and other social media apps, paying them in cryptocurrency. In some cases, if you want to be generous, the people who are being hired don't necessarily know they're working for the Russians, although they'd be stupid not to suspect it. And they're asked to do kind of low-level things, set this building alight with a petrol bomb. And so that was sort of phase one of this sort of new period, I would say. And it, of course, coincides with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's designed to do two things. One, disrupt, as I say, Western attempts to arm the Ukrainians, but also to sow fear and paranoia and terror. And one of the problems I think Western governments have had is there's a real reluctance to come clean about the full extent and scale of what the Russians are now doing on EU, NATO soil, because the fear is that the electorate will, first panic and then possibly lower its level of support for Ukraine, thinking that, okay, look, if the Russians are taking the war to us right here at home, maybe it's time we just kind of cut and run. But now what we're observing through some of the investigative work that we're doing in the Insider is that the amateur hour is sort of subsiding, and there's a new attempt to kind of semi-professionalize these operations. So instead of relying on native criminal elements, organized crime, disaffected teenagers, they're actually beginning to recruit foreigners properly, in some cases training them and dispatching them into the field. We've seen evidence that so far Venezuelans, Cubans, quite a lot of Ukrainians who have fled from the war as refugees, and either because they can't make ends meet or perhaps their sympathies lay with the opposition, are all too willing to be complicit. And because, of course, these guys have passports that allow them to travel easily through Europe, where Russian operatives under even fake Russian passports cannot do that, they become easy marks. So, again, this suggests that the GRU and Unit 29155 in particular, which has been aggressive since its constitution, the first explosion or bombings, I should say, of ammunition and weapons depots started in 2011. So that was in the midst of the Obama-Putin reset, well before even the first invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. And it was designed to disrupt attempts by Western arms dealers to resupply the Georgian and the Ukrainian militaries. So they've been doing this for over a decade. But now I would say, we like to be euphemistic in the West about what Russia is up to. This is low-intensity warfare or gray zone sort of operations. But no, I would describe it for what it is. It's acts of war. It's acts of state terrorism. And the GRU, it was founded in 1918 to prepare for war with the West. So as I say, these guys are kind of, hearkening back to a century-old tradition and their core remit. And they're very, very brazen. Their capacity for failure, or their capacity to withstand failure in the pursuit of prosecuting their goals, is great. Cubans, Venezuelans, Ukrainians are expendable. Some of their own operatives who got caught on CCTV, for instance, poisoning Yulia and Sergei Skripal, they're now in sinecure positions inside Russia. They got their Hero of the Russian Federation award. They're living quite happily. So, it's sort of the old saw, I guess, that the IRA used to say, you have to be lucky every time, we only have to be lucky once, right? And it only takes a few of these operations to be successful to, as I say, kind of instill that sense of fear and panic and paranoia in the West. So I think we can expect to see a lot more of this in the coming years.
Now, there's a lot of people in the UK that sort of pride ourselves, big slap on the back for kicking out a load of Russian intelligence officers and exposing the GRU and those guys, a ridiculous sort of, 132-metre spire at Salisbury, all that, what a big laugh. But actually you're suggesting that 29155 just sort of shrugged it off and just shifted their focus, shifted their means of operation and came back stronger.
Yeah, I think their activities have been disrupted, but I would not say that they have been deterred. Their operatives are largely known in the West. Their biometrics are in every database in Europe. I have to say, largely thanks to the work my colleague Christo Grozev did in unmasking them all. But again, there are new recruits all the time. There's a new generation of GRU operatives that are joining 29155. And even organizationally or hierarchically, what we're finding is 29155's sort of top-level echelon, including and especially their commander, General Andrei Avryanov, who's now a deputy director of the GRU, are reconstituting themselves under the umbrella known as the Department of Special Tasks. Special Tasks is one of those old Soviet euphemisms for essentially what these guys specialize in: assassination, sabotage, kinetic activities. So 29155, it's important to understand, they're not traditional spies in the sense that they don't do collection, they don't eavesdrop, or if they do those things, it is always in pursuit of something that is violent. And as I say, the gloves were never on to begin with, but insofar as they've decided to ratchet up their operations and their willingness to essentially conduct acts of war against the West, we all have to be quite vigilant. And, the question is Western counterintelligence and law enforcement able to stop every one of these operations? And I think the answer is quite clearly no.
And they're expanding. They've been seen overseas working with others in the, what are we calling it, axis of upheaval or whatever you want to put.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most alarming bits of data that we came across in the last few months is 29155 sent a delegation, including the aforementioned Avrianov, the head of the unit, to Tehran in February of 2023. And they had high-level liaison with their counterparts in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And again, wherever 29155 goes, if you can attribute anything to them, it sort of gets your backup, because these guys aren't just spies. They're planning something kinetic. So the question is, what were they planning with the Iranians? And clearly, Russia and Iran are strategically wedded. They were so in Syria before the fall of Bashar al-Assad last December, but they're at war together against Ukraine. You've got Iranian Shahid drones, ballistic missiles. Shahids are now being manufactured in Russia. But if the IRGC is getting in on this action, I mean, look at what that organization has done over the course of several decades. I mean, these guys are past masters at standing up their own militias, paramilitary units, recruiting Arab Shia in Iraq, in Syria. You know, the Russians used to say that but for Hezbollah and the assorted militias that Assad was relying on even more heavily than his army, now defunct, there would have been no successful Russian intervention. I mean, they had about a squadron of aircraft and some GRU officers on the ground in Syria that whole time. But that relationship was really solidified over the last decade or so in Syria. And now it looks to be broadening.
By the way, we've just seen the arrest in London of an Iranian network.
Exactly. So yeah, I would not be surprised if, you know, in the next year or two, you begin to see headlines that suggest that there's a collaborative mechanism at play. And of course, a lot of this is going to depend on whatever diplomacy or Western policies are undertaken with respect to both Moscow and Tehran, right? If there is some grand bargain or grand deal over the war in Ukraine, Putin feels like the U.S. is headed in a trajectory of strategic realignment toward Russia or rapprochement with Russia, they might lower the temperature. They might wind back some of these operations to, you know, let this policy set in. If, however, they feel that peace negotiations are going nowhere, if the U.S. increases sanctions or decides to really penalize, go after the Russian economy, hit them where it hurts, as Lindsey Graham keeps threatening to do, I would expect the opposite, an increase in the tempo. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah. I won't keep you any longer from your lunch.
No,
appreciate it. Cheers,
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Durnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Alexis Adamora. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.